Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. A little bit different tonight. If you see my background looks a little bit different. I am not in my office. I am at Bedford Park Public Library. So we are doing this presentation hybrid. We have people here live at the library. And then, of course, we have all of you over Zoom. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're really excited about this presentation with Ken Johnson. Ken is the horticulture educator of the University of Illinois, serving Calhoun, Cass, Greene, Morgan, and Scott counties. And I just talked to him and he said it's really not that much warmer down there. So, you know, we don't have to like be envious of him, but he said their spring does start, you know, a couple weeks earlier than ours. So his educational efforts focus on fruit and vegetable production, pest management, and beneficial insects, which he will be talking about tonight, helping us to understand and help our declining native pollinators. Through his programming efforts, he aims to increase backyard food production and foster a greater appreciation of insects. He is one of the authors of the Illinois Extension Good Growing blog and one of the Good Growing podcast hosts. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce Ken Johnson. Hello, Ken.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming to your office. I am going to go ahead and disappear.
All right, seeing my screen okay?
Perfect.
All right, so tonight we're going to talk about pollinators and specifically bees. We're going to focus primarily on bees, but stuff we're going to talk about is going to apply to pretty much all pollinators in general. All right, so first off, you've probably heard in the news a lot the last several years, a lot of talk about pollinator decline and really insect decline in general, specifically the last several years for insects in general, but pollinator decline has kind of been in the news for a while. In fact, back in 2007, there was a status of pollinators in North America report released. And these were kind of the factors they listed as why pollinators are declining. So there's not any one single factor. There's a variety of different factors, whether that be pathogens and parasites. For example, there's some pathogens and parasites on honeybees that have been introduced, and they can get into some of our native bee species. And there's also other pathogens and parasites that will affect other pollinators as well besides bees. Exposure to pesticides is another big issue, whether that be pesticide misuse, overuse. Even if you're using them properly, you still run the risk of exposing pollinators to pesticides. So that is a big factor. Habitat fragmentation and loss. So, you know, when we think about what Illinois used to be like, predominantly prairie, some forested areas as well. Now, in a lot of parts of the state, that's going to be farmland, more residential areas that don't necessarily support pollinator populations nearly as well as what our landscape used to look like. And then some of those areas that we do have, you know, a lot of habitat for pollinators and stuff, a lot of that's fragmented. So you've got small pockets here and there where pollinators can't necessarily easily travel in between sometimes. Climate change can also be is also one of the factors as to pollinator and insect decline. Specifically for pollinators, we can get some of the timing, that phenology messed up where flowers, this specific, particularly for kind of our specialist pollinators that specialize on a certain type of flower, maybe a certain species or family of plants, that the phenology gets thrown off. So your flowers are blooming before the pollinators come out, or the pollinators come out before the flowers are available. That can cause some problems for the specialist types. With climate change, we're seeing shifts in where plants and insects and animals can survive. So things are shifting north. Some areas that may be getting too hot for some of these to survive down the road potentially. And then we also have competition with introduced and invasive species, whether these be other insects. In the case of honeybees, those can outcompete many of our native pollinators in some instances, or we have invasive plant species that come in and push out our native plant species, reducing the amount of food and food plants that these pollinators have available to them. So a variety of different factors. There's no one thing, no silver bullet to kind of fix this problem. There's a lot of different things that we kind of have to look into and try to fix to help support our pollinators and insects in general. So why should I care? So many plants are not able to reproduce without the help of pollinators. 75% of all plants on Earth are pollinated by animals, for the most part insects, and over 90% of flowering plants are going to be pollinated by insects. We've got things like grasses and oak trees and stuff like that that are wind pollinated, but most of our flowering plants need insects or some other animal to pollinate them. The plants these insects are pollinating are going to provide food for humans. That tends to be what we focus on, but they also provide food for wildlife, migratory birds, other animals as well. And those pollinators can also serve as a food source for a lot of this wildlife as well, like birds and other animals. We're going to talk about bees tonight, and that's what gets most of the focus when it comes to pollinators. But butterflies, moths, wasps, beetles, flies, birds, and bats will also do a lot of pollination. Birds and bats, not so much in the Midwest. Hummingbirds would be an exception, but that's a lot more tropical or desert area environments where birds and bats are going to be a little more important for pollination. So just talk a little bit about the food aspect of pollination. So these are some fruits and vegetables that require pollination in order to get fruit production. So over 150 food crops in the United States require some sort of pollination in order to reproduce. And that's going to be things like our tree fruit, our apples, pears, or that type of stuff. Our small fruits, our blackberries, our blueberries, our raspberries, things like that. We even have things like broccoli, celery, cauliflower. We're not eating the fruit of those plants, but we still need those plants to produce seed so we can plant them. So we may not be eating the fruit itself, but we need pollination in order to get seed production so we can plant more of them. All of our cucurbits are going to need pollinators, our cucumbers, our squash, our watermelons, all of that stuff. We also have fruits and vegetables that are going to benefit from pollination. So these plants can still reproduce without pollinators being around. But again, from our human perspective, when we have pollinators present, we tend to get more fruit, and that fruit tends to be larger in some cases as well. So it's better for us if they get pollinated. So example in the pictures there down at the bottom, on that left, we have a typical strawberry that's been cross-pollinated by insects. So insects have had access to those flowers. They can be pollinated. We get that large, plump, fully developed strawberry that we want to buy in the grocery store. On the right, in this experiment, they excluded insects and wind from those flowers. And you can see those plants are still self-fertilized. You still have seed production. So we kind of anthropomorphize plants a little bit. From their perspective, they can still reproduce. It's not a big deal. But that's not something we as humans are going to want to buy. We're not going to be particularly happy if our strawberries look like that in our garden. So by having insects access those flowers, being able to pollinate them, we get larger fruit, we get more of it. In the case of strawberries, those fruit last longer. They have longer shelf life if they're pollinated by insects. Same thing with tomatoes. Those can self-pollinate, but if you have insects present pollinating them, you tend to get more tomatoes on your plants. Like I mentioned, they do have benefits to the ecosystem, so they help support healthy ecosystems that clean the air, stabilize soil, protect from severe weather, support other wildlife. So those berries that the plants produce, birds will feed on. The caterpillars feeding on those plants, birds will feed to their young, what have you. We have plants on stream banks. They need to reproduce. Those roots are going to hold those stream banks together so you don't get washed out, so on and so forth. Our ecosystems depend on pollinators to help replenish those plant communities over time. So when it comes to pollination, what are insects after? So first is going to be nectar. So nectar is kind of the reward that plants have made to entice insects to come and help them with pollination. So nectar is typically going to be buried deep within the flower, so that when the insects visit, in our case insects, visit that flower, they brush up against those reproductive structures. They'll pick up pollen from the anther. That pollen will be transferred to the stigma, and the plants will get fertilized and produce seeds and fruit and all of that fun stuff. That nectar is going to be sugary. It's going to have amino acids and things like that insects are going to use as a food source. So for bees, nectar along with pollen are the only things they feed on. So they need this stuff. If you like honey, nectar is going to be the base ingredient of honey. So honeybees are going to consume that nectar, they'll hold it in their crop, they'll mix it with some enzymes, they'll regurgitate it, and they'll dry it out to some extent, and it'll become honey. So honey is a little bit like bee vomit, if you want to think of it that way. Pollen is another thing that pollinators are going to visit flowers for. So pollen are dust-like grains that are unique to each plant species. And these are going to have basically have the sperm cells inside of them. And that's what's going to land on the stigma, that female part. Pollen will kind of germinate. They'll have a pollen tube that'll go down. That sperm will then travel down into the ovaries and fertilize the ovaries and get seed production. And again, the pollen is going to have proteins, sugars, fats, minerals, amino acids, all of that stuff. And that's going to be a food source for many pollinators, particularly things like beetles and bees will feed on pollen. So a little background there. So now we'll start talking specifically about bees. So kind of the lives of bees, some of the different structures on the bees as well. So a little bit on bee anatomy. So tongue. Bee tongues have kind of a spoon-shaped tip, and this is going to allow the bees to lap up nectar. And you can see that yellow arrow there in the picture that is pointing to the tongue of the bee right there. So you can see, it's widened out a little bit. It's got a bunch of hairs on there. That nectar is going to cling to the hairs and move up the hairs, kind of like if you were to stick a paintbrush in watercolors. It'll kind of slowly work its way up, and that's how they're going to feed on that nectar. And bees will vary in their tongue length. So the longer the tongue, the deeper the corolla or deeper that flower can be, or they can access nectar in deeper flowers. So things like leafcutter bees, bumblebees, different species have fairly long tongues, so they can get down deeper into flowers than some other bees, like the sweat bees, which are much smaller bees, have smaller tongues. So they're going to like smaller flowers, probably more open flowers than say some of these larger bees that can get down deeper into flowers and access that nectar. Mandibles are also going to be important for bees. So these are kind of like their jaws. They can use this to feed on pollen. They can use it to collect nesting materials, manipulate wax, excavate nests from in the ground or in plant stems, things like that. And you can see that those mandibles on the bee on the top there, those black things sticking down, those are the mandibles. So what they're going to chew with and stuff. And males will also use mandibles in many species to hold females during mating and fight other males for territory. So the kind of multiple uses for bees here. When it comes to vision, so bees and other insects are going to have kind of two different types of eyes. They're going to have two compound eyes on the side of the head. This is what they are going to use to see with. These are made up of individual facets called ommatidia, and those will kind of stitch it together to make a picture. So it'd be kind of like if you held a handful of straws up to your eye and look through them, you have all these bunch of little pictures that are stitched together to form your field of vision. Then you have ocelli, 3 ocelli in the case of this bee are on the top of the head. They're not used to see images. It can help kind of detect light intensity and things like that. So it can help them orient themselves within the environment. When it comes to the color spectrum that bees can see, bees are going to see a different color spectrum than we do. So us as humans, our visible light for humans is going to be between 400 and 700 nanometers. So take you back to that high school physics here. Bees, on the other hand, see from about 600 to 300 nanometers. So they don't really see the color red, but they can see into the UV spectrum. So sometimes there are going to be patterns on flowers that are in that UV spectrum that we can't see that bees can pick up on. And on the flip side, they're not going to really see the color red, maybe some yellow and orange, but they don't really see the color red like we do. So if they're visiting red flowers, there may be patterns on their UV patterns and stuff that we can't see. A little bit more on the anatomy here. So bees are going to have different pollen collection structures on their bodies. So we have pollen collecting hairs, are also called scopa. So on this bee on the left here, you can see that kind of those orangish hairs on the bottom of the abdomen. They will use those to collect pollen. They'll pack pollen onto those. A lot of times these hairs are going to be kind of branched, kind of feathery almost, and that's going to help them hold on to the pollen a little bit better. Next to that bee on the left in the middle there, You can see that yellow pollen packed onto the underside of that bee. They can also have them on the legs, so that black bee in the middle, you can see that pollen is packed onto the hind legs. So depending on the species of bee, they may store it on the underside of the abdomen or on their legs. And then honeybees are going to have a pollen basket or a corbicula, and that's going to be on the hind legs. You can see that on the top picture there. They do have some hairs, but that leg segment is kind of widened, and it's a little bit kind of like a scoop shape, and they will pack pollen onto that so that they can collect that and then take it back to their nest. So that's one way you can tell if an insect is a bee or not, or if it's a fly mimicking a bee, is if they have these structures where they can collect pollen on them. All right, so the different types of bees. Like everything else, there's a variety of different ways we can categorize bees. People really like categorizing stuff. So we can categorize bees as social or solitary. So social bees are going to have that division of labor. You're going to have a reproductive queen, maybe sometimes multiple, but usually just one that's going to be laying the eggs. Then you're going to have workers that are caring for those eggs, those offspring. They're building the nest. They're going out and collecting pollen and nectar, bringing that back to the nest. And then we also have solitary bees. So for solitary bees, you have one female doing all the work by herself. She's excavating that nest. She's collecting the food. She's laying the eggs, all of that on her own. We have ground nesting and cavity nesting. So ground nesting bees build their nests in the ground, and cavity nesting bees could be something like the top picture there in the pithy centers of stems. This is old coneflower stalks. If you leave those behind, bees may inhabit those. Abandoned rodent burrows in the case of things like honeybees as well. They're building those nests in some kind of cavity. Bees will either build and provision their own nests, or there are some species that will parasitize others. So if they're building and provisioning their own nests, that they're doing that, parasitizing others. There are some bee species that will lay their eggs. And like bumblebees, there's some parasite type honeybees. They'll lay their eggs in a colony. Those eggs will hatch, and that other bumblebee will take care of those offspring of the parasites and care for them like they're their own. And then we can also categorize bees of whether or not they are generalists or specialists. So generalist pollinators or bees, they will visit a wide variety of type of flowers. They're not really stuck on visiting one type. Whereas specialist bees, they may be specific to a particular species. They may only feed on one species of flower. They may only do like a one genus, or have a much more narrow host range as far as what type of flowers they'll visit and feed on. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the different bees we have here in Illinois. So first off, the one most people are going to be familiar with is going to be the honeybee. This is not actually native to Illinois or North America. It is native to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and was brought over to North America when Europeans started colonizing the continent. This is going to be the most important bee for crop pollination, primarily because we can keep these in hives. They can be trucked long distances, and we can move them around the country to pollinate different crops. They are social insects, so we have a colony here, and these colonies are perennial, so they're going to survive year after year after year. That queen may get replaced, but that colony will continue going. At their peak, colonies can have 50,000 plus individuals in them. So you can see how these could be problematic if you have limited floral resources. They can go out and completely strip the landscape of pollen and nectar and not leave really anything for other species of bees. They are cavity nesting, which is why we can keep them in those colonies, in those hives, in those boxes and stuff. That bottom picture there, you can see that's the honeycomb that they've started to draw out there. And they are generalist pollinators, so they're going to visit a wide variety of different types of flowers. But in some cases, they're not particularly efficient at pollinating some of our native plants. Some of our native plant species need something called buzz pollination, so they need to be vibrated in order to release their pollen. When we think about food crops, things like tomatoes and blueberries, things like that, need that sonification, that buzzing to release their pollen. Honeybees don't do that. So for those type plants, they are not very efficient at pollinating them. And it makes sense. These plants and honeybees not evolve with each other, so they don't necessarily match up when it comes to pollination. So like I mentioned, we have a lot of different types of bees. So about 20,000 species worldwide is the estimate. 4,000 different species in Illinois, in the United States. And here in Illinois, we have about 500 different species. In Carlinville, Illinois, which is down here in central Illinois, kind of the Springfield area, they did some people did some research. They found 228 different species just in the Carlinville, Macoupin County area. So again, there's a large diversity. We tend to focus on honeybees, but there are a lot of different types of bees out there. So some of those other types of bees that we can find here in Illinois, and we're not going to talk about all of them. These are the ones that are probably most commonly encountered in a lot of landscapes. So bumblebees, probably another one most people are going to be familiar with. Bumblebees are actually native to all continents, but Australia and Antarctica, and they have been introduced into Australia. I don't think there's any in Antarctica yet. Needs to warm up a little bit before that can happen. But they will do buzz pollination. So these are ones, they will hold on to flowers, they'll vibrate their flight muscles, and this will cause flowers to release their pollen that they can then collect, and the plants will then be pollinated. Compared to honeybees, they can operate in cooler temperatures. So they tend to be out, if we have a cloudy, maybe a little bit drizzly day, bumblebees may be out, whereas honeybees will just stick around in their hive. Honeybees are a little bit kind of fair weathered when it comes to collecting pollen and nectar and visiting flowers, whereas bumblebees and some of our native bee species will go out in less than ideal conditions sometimes. These are social insects, but their colonies are annual, so they will die out every year and they will start a new colony. So they will, this time of year, they're sending out new queens. Those will mate, and then they will overwinter, and then they will emerge in the spring, and they will start a new colony, and that cycle will repeat. They are cavity nesting. So this picture here, this is actually from England. So this is not a species we have here in the United States, but they will nest a lot of times in abandoned rodent burrows. I've heard of them, people finding them in compost piles, at the bases of bunch grasses, anywhere where there's a cavity that they can build, sufficiently sized cavity where they can build their nests. For the most part, they build and provision their own nests, but there are a few species that will parasitize other bumblebee species. And again, they are generalist pollinators, so they're visiting a wide variety of different types of flowers. I mentioned they're social. Their colonies get to be about 50 to 400 individuals at their peak. So depending on the species, not nearly as large as honeybee colonies are going to be. We have about 11 species in Illinois. Carpenter bees. So these are mostly tropical. We do have one species we can find here in Illinois, the eastern carpenter bee. And these are fairly large bees. They can be about an inch long. Because they are so large, they tend to like large open-faced flowers. It's easier for them to access compared to really small flowers. And because they are so large, sometimes they will rob nectar from smaller flowers. So that's what's happening in this picture on the top here. That carpenter bee is biting a hole at the base of that plant so we can access that nectar, and it's going to bypass all that pollen and the stigma and all that. So they're not pollinating those plants, they're just stealing the nectar. So the plant's not getting any benefit from that carpenter bee visiting that flower. Some people will consider these a pest because they do build their nests in wood, and that could be your deck, in your garage, in the rafters, and things like that. Best way to prevent that is to paint wood. They don't like painted surfaces. A lot of times that's all you have to do, and they will leave that wood alone, but they can be a pest sometimes. If you get enough of them building nests, you could potentially compromise the integrity of your structure. But you'd have to have quite a few of them doing that. Carpenter bees, primarily solitary, but every once in a while you will have some females working together kind of socially almost. Like I mentioned, they build their nests in wood. They are tunneling. You can see that on the bottom picture there, a piece of wood that they have tunneled in. They've cut apart. So you see they start burrowing in, and they take kind of a 90-degree turn, and that's where they're going to lay their eggs in those chambers off that 90-degree turn. They build and provision their own nests. So they're kind of excavating these holes, and sometimes they will be reused in subsequent years. A lot of times they're starting them on their own, and they're generalist pollinators. We also have another type of carpenter bee. These are called small carpenter bees because they are much smaller and their jaws are much weaker, so they're not building their nests in solid wood, but they are using the pithy centers as stems. So that picture on the bottom there, you can see that's been excavated out. They've provisioned each of those individual cells with some pollen mixed in with maybe some nectar and some saliva. They lay their egg on that pollen ball, and then they'll just go down the line, making these different chambers. And those little white kind of shiny things, those are the bee larvae feeding on that pollen. And these are solitary bees. So you have one female doing all this work by herself. So she's excavating that nest, she's collecting all the food, she's laying the eggs all by herself. And these small carpenter bees, a lot of times they're metallic color, like this one here, this blue. They're blue, black, or green, fairly sparsely haired. Maybe confused with wasps sometimes because they're not really hairy like we typically think of bees. Next up, we've got mason bees. So osmia is going to be the group people are primarily going to be familiar with and probably see. And these are important if you grow a tree fruit. Mason bees are going to be important for that. They emerge early in the year when our tree fruit are blooming. So they're going to be important for those tree fruits, apples and things like that, to get pollinated. They're called mason bees because they will use mud to divide their brood cells. And you can see that on the picture on the bottom there. So again, they're tunnel nesting. So whether that be pithy stems, galleries made in wood by beetles, or if you're putting out nesting boxes, those man-made straws or wood blocks, mason bees will be one of the species people are trying to attract with those. They will line those holes with mud, and they will seal off those individual brood chambers with mud as well. And again, you can see they have that pollen ball in there. They'll lay an egg in there, and they'll just go down the line doing that. So about the time mason bees, so they're out early in the year, and then they kind of, they do their thing, and then they die off, and then they're done kind of by the summertime, and then they don't emerge again until the spring. When mason bees start waning, the leafcutter bees start coming out. And they're very similar to mason bees, but instead of mud to line their walls and divide their brood cells, they're using leaf petals to do this. So you can see on the top picture there, they'll cut out these round notches from the margins of leaves. They like things that have kind of thin leaf, don't have a lot of veins in them. So things like rose, lilac, Virginia creeper, ash trees, while we still had them, they will utilize those types of leaves. Again, they're solitary nesting, just like the mason bees, those galleries by beetles, pithy stems, and those man-made straws or wood nesting blocks they will also readily use. Sweat bees are another pretty common bee that we see in a lot of different landscapes. So a lot of these are brightly colored, or dark, or metallic. So those metallic little, sometimes you call them sweat flies. Those are actually bees. A lot of times they'll be marked. A lot of times the abdomens may be yellow and black striped. They can also be different colors, green and red as well. A lot of times they're attracted to perspiration, your sweat, for the moisture and the salt in them. So that's why they're visiting you, trying to feed on that sweat. These insects primarily are solitary, and a lot of times they will build their nests. A lot of them will build the nest in the same area, so it may look like you've got a colony there, but each individual hole is one female. There's a favorable environment, so they all kind of build their nests in one area, but it's all individual females doing their own thing. And they nest primarily in the ground. So 70% of our bee species, native bee species, actually nest in the ground. And sweat bees would be one of those types. And just some other types of bees that you may encounter in your landscapes. And again, this isn't all of them. So on the top left there, that's a wool carder bee. That is an introduced species from Europe. You see them a lot on things like lamb's ear. At least in my yard, I get them all over the place because they will collect the fibers from that to build their nest. Down on the bottom left, that's a Calides, polyester bee. In the middle, we got some longhorn bees. See those a lot on things like sunflowers. At least I do in my yard. And then on the right, those two pictures, that is squash bee. So they are specialists on pumpkins and other cucurbits. So if you grow those and you grow them, for several years, you may get those moving in, but they also nest in the ground. So if you're tilling your garden up and you're growing pumpkins and you have those, you're potentially destroying those nests. So keep that in mind. If you're interested in some of the other types of bees we have in Illinois, we do have this Illinois Bees handout through Extension. You can just go to that website there, go.illinois.edu/Illinois Bees, and that'll bring up this little handout. Gets into detail on how to identify some of these different bees we can find in Illinois. And if if you forget the website, you can always email me and I will send you a copy of that. All right. Probably the reason most of you are here is how can we make our landscapes more friendly, just specifically to bees? But this is also going to benefit really any pollinator and insects in general by doing some of this stuff. So first off, a lot of times when we talk about pollinators, we talk about pollinator syndromes, and this is, I'm going to say controversial, but there is some kind of pushback on how realistic this is. But pollinator syndromes, if you're not familiar with what they are, we can look at different traits of the flower. So the color of the flower, what it smells like, how much nectar and pollen does it have, what's the shape of that flower. You can look at these different traits and you can predict what type of insect is going to potentially visit and pollinate, or what traits these different pollinators are attracted to. So again, we've got all kinds of different pollinators. We're just going to focus on bees for tonight, but here's kind of that whole list there. So when it comes to bees, again, this is just general guidelines. This is not written in stone, but the flowers bees tend to visit tend to be bright white, yellow, blue, purple, or UV in color. So again, they can see into the UV spectrum, whereas we cannot. Nectar guides are going to be present. If you're not sure what nectar guides are, that's going to be the next slide. Odor tends to be fresh, mild, and pleasant. So a lot of the flowers that we find attractive, bees also find attractive, which is why we tend to see a lot of them in our landscapes. Nectar is usually going to be present. Again, that is a primary food source for them. Pollen. So the table I have here, I took a column off of this. It also includes wind pollinated plants. So, pollen limited relative to wind pollinated plants. So if you've ever parked underneath an oak tree, a pine tree, something like that, when it's shedding pollen, you know how much pollen those plants can release. So just kind of take that limited with a grain of salt there. Sometimes that pollen is going to be sticky or scented, help them pack them on their bodies a little bit better. Flowers tend to be shallow, or they have a landing platform and they're kind of tubular. Again, not set in stone, but just kind of general guidelines for what many bees are going to find attractive. So nectar guides. So the picture on the left there shows what flower looks like under normal light. So the visible light spectrum visible to humans. And then on the right of that, on the picture on the left, is under UV light. So you can see this dark area in the middle there. That is the nectar guide. So nectar guides are kind of like a billboard saying, hey, come this way. This is where the nectar is at on the flower. Same thing, same idea with this foxglove on the right here. You can see all those little dots leading up into that flower. That's that nectar guide, kind of showing the bees where the nectar is. You follow this path, you'll get to the nectar type thing. That's the idea behind nectar guides. And a lot of times these are going to be kind of visible in the UV spectrum, so we can't see them. But you can go on the internet, search nectar guides UV light on your favorite search engine, and there's all kinds of pictures out there of all kinds of different patterns on flowers that we can't see, but bees can. Circles kind of making a target pattern, lines and stuff. Again, those nectar guides kind of guiding those bees to where the pollen is at. So some things we can do in our landscapes. So we want to try to choose heavy pollen and nectar producing plants. We want to try to avoid getting highly modified flowers, things like double flowers that can make it difficult to access that pollen and nectar. There's a lot of petals in there. It makes it more difficult for the insects to access them. There's some debate as to the nativar debate. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of research done on that. The Mount Cuba Center in Delaware, they do trials on native plants on different cultivars that are released. And for their trials, they have started looking at pollinator visitation. And a year or two ago, they came out with one on cone flowers. And they actually found that one of the cultivars, which was a white cultivar, and I can't remember the name now, was actually had more pollinator visitations than the straight species did. So in general, we recommend, you want the straight species, but in some cases they have found that nativars can be more attractive. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done on this. It's still kind of muddy. And obviously, the ones that are highly modified, double flowers, really weird and crazy colors may not be all that attractive. So if you can, try to do a little bit of research if you want to plant a native-are. I would argue that planting a native-are is better than planting nothing. I think a lot of that comes down to a little bit of individual preference there. Now, we want to try to plant a variety of different flowers for season-long blooming and blossom shapes. So we mentioned that, mason bees are coming out early in the year, and then they're going to be followed up by leafcutter bees. Bumblebees and stuff are going to be out the whole season. So we've got different species of bees that are going to be around at different times of the year. And different flower sizes. So we got bees that have different sized tongues, so they're going to be attracted to different types of flowers, and just pollinators in general. They're going to be attracted to different types of flowers. So having multiple types of plants blooming with different flower shapes, different colors, is going to make your landscape that much more attractive to pollinators in general. And we want to try to plant in clumps rather than single plants. Again, something is better than nothing, but if your mass plantings are going to be better, they're going to be more attractive. I kind of think of it as, would you rather go to one grocery store to get all your groceries, or would you rather have to drive around town and go to 5, 6 different places to get all your groceries? If you got everything at one spot, it's going to be more attractive to those pollinators, easier for them to find that stuff. That bottom picture there, that is one of the parks here in Jacksonville. So every spring it is covered in spring beauty. So it's, unfortunately, they mow it a little bit early, in my opinion, but for a week or two there, the park is almost completely white with all those flowers. So again, those mass plantings make it easier and more attractive to those pollinators. Real quick here, I'm not going to spend too much time on these individual flowers. If you want more information with these, you can send me an email. I will send you a handout of this PowerPoint if you really want to get all this information. But the kind of thing we want to focus on for these is look at that bloom time. So again, we want multiple plants blooming at different times of the year. So something like dogtooth violet. So this is going to be blooming March to May, depending on where you're at in the state. They like part to full shade. This is a spring ephemeral, so it's going to die back once it starts heating up in the summer. They'll attract a variety of different bees, so bumblebees, mason bees, and Geranium bees as well. And before I go too farther, I will point out that most of these pictures and a good chunk of the information is coming from the Illinois Wildflowers.info site that Dr. John Hilty has put together. If you are not familiar with that site, I would encourage you to visit it. Illinois Wildflowers.info. A lot of information on all different native plant species we can find, their identification, where they grow in the state, and they also have a lot of information on what type of insects visit them, larval food hosts, things like that. It's one of the few places that I found that has all that information in one place. You can find that stuff, but it's kind of dispersed all over the place. This is a nice kind of centralized location for that information. Baptisia, wild indigo, again, blooming March to June. It will depend on the species, and there are some cultivated varieties that are available as well. Full sun to part shade, can get 1 to 4 feet tall. And then attracting bumblebees primarily, because these are kind of pea-shaped flowers. They need to be forced open. So you need some bigger, more robust, stronger bees to get into there. Wild geranium, moving a little bit later into the year, April to June. Full sun, part shade, they probably do a little bit better in light to partial shade. They can tolerate full sun if you have moist enough conditions. If they're in full sun and they dry out, they're not going to look all that great. So make sure they have plenty of water if you're going to do that. And you can see in the bottom of the variety of different types of bees will visit these plants. Penstemon, foxglove beard tongue, whatever you want to call it there. So May to July, 2 to 4 feet tall, again, sun, moist, well-drained soils, and a variety of different types of bees are going to visit them, and they will bloom for a long period of time. Purple coneflower, echinacea. This is probably the most, at least what I see, at least down here in Jacksonville area, Central Illinois, probably the most widely planted native plant there is. Again, there's another one. There's a lot of breeding that's been done, a lot of different cultivars and stuff that are available. So again, steer away from those double bloomed types if you're planting if you want to have the benefit of attracting pollinators. If you just want a pretty flower, go for it. But if you want to help pollinators, try to avoid those double flowers. June to October. I know right now mine are looking pretty rough, pretty ragged. I've had some Aster yellows come through, so I've had to pull some plants out. But then again, they do have a very good long bloom season. All those orange spikes, if you look closely down in there, on the top picture, you can kind of see in the bottom picture, there's individual flowers in there. So these are kind of like sunflowers. They have a bunch of different disc flowers on there down inside those spikes. Anise Hup is another one, summer and early fall blooming, June to September. Again, 2 to 4 feet tall, full sun, part shade, and again, a variety of different types of bees will visit it. Will spread by rhizomes and self-seed. So if you've got a small area, it may not be the best choice, or you're gonna have to keep an eye on it and maybe contain it a little bit so it doesn't take over. Swamp milkweed is another one. This is pretty much the only milkweed we can have in Illinois that will take really wet soils or wetland type conditions. So these are used a lot in like rain gardens. Where I've planted them in my landscape, I put them near my downspouts because they can handle those wetter conditions compared to some of the other milkweed species. June to August blooming, again, full sun to part sun as well. And even though it's swamp milkweed, they will tolerate some dry conditions once they're established. And these are not really aggressive like common milkweed, which can be aggressive and problematic in smaller areas. Rattlesnake Master, this is one that is quickly becoming one of my favorite native plants, at least in my landscape. So bloom time, June to September. Says 3 to 4 feet tall, but that's the flower stalk. The actual leaves and plant itself is maybe, I would say, 1 foot to 18 inches tall. It kind of looks like a yucca plant almost that sends out these tall flower stalks. A variety of different bees, a lot of wasps will visit them as well. Again, tolerant of dry conditions once they're established, and they do have a taproot, which makes them difficult to transplant. So if you are planting this, make sure you put it in a place that you want it. You don't want to have to try to move it later. Liatris, this particularly prairie blazing star for this one. There are multiple different species of blazing stars that will grow here in Illinois. This particular one, July to August. There's some other species, rough blazing star, scaly blazing star that bloom a little bit later in the season, maybe the August to September timeframe. I've got some that are just finishing up blooming right now. Full sun, 3 to 5 feet tall. They're pretty narrow plant. So it's, they may be a little bit tall, but they're not really wide. They're real narrow, so they're not kind of blocking the view or anything like that. And these are moist, well-drained soils. And again, they tolerate poor soil conditions, drought, summer heat. They're a pretty resilient plant. We've got Monarda, wild bergamot, it's called bee balm, July to September. This is one you can get some powdery mildew. Plants can start looking pretty ragged in that August timeframe a lot of times. And it is a mint, so it can be on the aggressive side and spread in a landscape. So again, have it contained, maybe not be the best idea for a small landscape, or if you do, you're going to have to keep on it so it doesn't take over. Smooth aster, so August to October. So we're getting into stuff that's blooming. This time of year, a lot of different types of asters that are native to Illinois that'll do well in landscapes. This is a shorter one, 1 to 3 feet tall, moist, well-drained, dry soils. Powdery mildew can be an issue. I haven't seen it too much on the smooth aster I have, but it can be sometimes. And then finally, our goldenrod. So pick showy goldenrod for this. This one is not nearly as aggressive as some of the other types. It does not spread by rhizomes like some of our other goldenrods do. So this is a little bit safer choice for our landscapes. 2 to 6 feet tall, so it can get a little bit on the tall side if that's a concern. But very pretty flowers, and a lot of times goldenrod gets blamed for seasonal allergies, hay fever in the fall, but it is not going to be the case. Typically that's ragweed that's causing that. Ragweed blooms at the same time. It's kind of got green flowers, nondescript flowers, and it is wind pollinated, so it's sending its pollen out all over the place. Whereas goldenrod is insect pollinated, so it's much heavier pollen it's not getting picked up and blown around in the wind. So it's a nice showy flower that gets blamed for everybody's allergies, but the real culprit is typically going to be ragweed. So why I went through all this is kind of what we want, a basic idea of what we want our blooming schedule to look like. So we can see we've got multiple plant species blooming from March into October is ideally what we want in our landscapes. If you've only got one, that's fine, but ideally we want at least 2 or 3 species blooming in our landscapes. And I would say for most of our landscapes, we do well in that May through August, maybe early September timeframe, but kind of on those color months, that March, April, September, October, a lot of our landscapes, we get a little bit low on those flowers, those pollen and nectar resources. And those are 2 very important times. Think about the spring, March, April, things like bumblebees, those queens are emerging. They need to build up those reserves. They need to be able to build those nests, lay their eggs, collect food for their offspring until they can get those hatched, and those workers will start doing it. We've got other pollinators that have overwintered that are waking up, and again, they need to build up those food reserves. And then September, October, we've got those individuals that are going to be hibernating over the winter. So they need to build up those reserves so they can make it through the winter. So there's 2 kind of critical time frames for a lot of our pollinators. A lot of times we can get a little bit of a dearth in the landscape for our nectar and pollen resources. So if you're going to be creating new habitat or adding more flowers to your landscape, really kind of take an inventory on what do you have blooming in those early and late season times, and add some stuff if you need to. Just some quick notes on native plants. So, a native plant is a plant that's been recorded as growing wild in an area at the time that scientific collection began in the area. Now, some people are going to define native plants a little bit differently. For some individuals, if it's native to North America, that's good enough for them. Some people want it native to the Midwest. Some people want it native to Illinois. Some people want it native to their specific county. Is there a right or wrong answer? I don't know. I think a lot of that's up to the individual as to how strict you want to be about native plants. And just because if it's a native plant, it doesn't mean it's going to be a good garden plant. Things like some of the goldenrods, common milkweed, those can be very aggressive. A lot of times people call them invasive, but by definition, they can't be invasive because they're native. Better term would be aggressive. They are very aggressive plants. They will quickly take over small areas. So we need to keep them contained or avoid them in our landscapes. Does not necessarily mean they have fewer and disease pest problems. When we're out in nature, so to speak, we tend to overlook the ragged leaves, the diseases on leaves, the insects feeding on that stuff. When it's in your right by your front door, you see it all the time. You tend to notice those problems a lot more. So our native plants are still going to have diseases. They're still going to have pest problems, quote unquote pest problems on them. Just because it's native doesn't necessarily mean it's going to grow better. For climate, our native plants are native to Illinois. They have adapted to our climate. But when we think about some of our urban and suburban landscapes, particularly new builds, what do they do when they build a house? They come in, they scrape off all that topsoil, and for the most part, it doesn't get put back. So you're planting stuff into subsoil. Our native plants not evolve to grow in subsoils. So they may struggle in some of our degraded soils that we see in urban and suburban landscapes, or really compacted soils. They didn't necessarily evolve to grow in those either. So they may struggle in some of these situations. And it does not mean they're more desirable than non-native plants. So say you're taking a hike through the woods, you notice this little flower right here, you think, hey, that's pretty. It's a vine. I want to put it in my landscape. I want to grow up a trellis or something like that. That is the flower of poison ivy. Admittedly, this is a bit of an extreme example, but poison ivy is a native plant, and I don't know of anybody that wants poison ivy in their landscape. So just because it's native, again, doesn't mean it's going to be a good garden plant, and doesn't mean it's something you want in your landscape. There are native plants that have toxic berries and toxic parts of their plant. If you have kids or pets, that may not be the best option for your landscape. So just keep that in the back of your mind. When it comes to plants, trees and shrubs can also play an important role when it comes to pollinators, and they get overlooked a lot in our landscapes. We tend to focus on those herbaceous perennials or those flowers that are going to die back and then resume growth from the ground the following year. But our woody plants can provide a lot of flowers. When you think about a tree, they produce a tremendous amount of flowers on there, especially early in the year. Things like maples, redbuds, things like that. They're blooming early in the year when a lot of our herbaceous perennials are not up yet. So again, if you're creating some pollinator habitat, or you're enhancing it or adding some more plants, consider trees. I will say a little note of caution on maples. In a lot of parts of the state, maples are getting overplanted. We haven't really learned our lesson yet. So we had our elms. Dutch elm disease came in and wiped out the elms. A lot of places replaced their elms with ash. Emerald ash borer came in and replaced and wiped out the ash trees. And now a lot of places are replacing their ash trees with maples. Now, there's nothing that's out there yet that's wiping out maple trees. But if you're considering planting a maple, take a walk around your neighborhood and see if there are a lot of maples out there. You may want to consider something else. We want to try to diversify our urban tree canopy, as we don't want to plant all one thing, because it's gotten us in trouble several times already. So just a word of caution on maples. Make sure there's not a tremendous amount of maples already in your neighborhood if you're going to plant those. Ornamental annual bedding plants can also be attractive to pollinators. So just because you have some of these ornamental annual plants in your landscapes does not mean you need to rip everything out and go everything native. These plants will still provide pollen nectar resources for our pollinators. So they can add color. You can slowly remove them or keep them and just add native plants. You don't necessarily have to rip everything out. University of Minnesota did some studies on some of these annuals and ornamental plants to see what was really attractive to pollinators and things like that. And these are some examples of the ones they found. So allium, purple sensation on the top left there was particularly attractive to pollinators. In the middle there, salvia, particularly Victoria blue cultivar, zinnia, pop art white and red, which is not this flower. I could not find a picture of that I could use, but zinnias in general are attractive, particularly for butterflies. I don't know if I've ever seen a zinnia planting without butterflies on it. Bottom left, cosmos, capriola, particularly for that cultivar. And bottom middle, autumn joy sedum, again, not a native plant, but I have been to areas where they have large plantings of these, and you can hear bees buzzing on them from 20, 30 feet away. They're very attracted to them. And then on the right there, sunflowers. These are a native plant to North America, but people kind of tend to overlook that. But they are an annual. They are very attractive to a lot of types of pollinators, including bees. Now, if you are going to plant sunflowers, read the plant descriptions. More and more, if people are growing sunflowers more and more for cut flowers, and a lot of those cut flowers, sunflowers that are being produced for cut flower production are pollenless because people don't want that pollen shedding, in their cut flowers and making a mess on tables and stuff like that. So a lot of those, I think some of the Pro Cut series, those are pollenless. Those are not. You can plant them, but they're not going to be nearly as attractive to pollinators as those that produce pollen. So if you're planting sunflowers for pollinators, steer away from those pollenless varieties. Herbs. So in our vegetable gardens or herb gardens, our herbs can also be attractive to a lot of different pollinators. So things like dill, basil, oregano, the different types of mints. If you grow those, maybe let some of those plants go to flower. From a horticultural perspective, for harvesting those, the quality of those plants goes down. The oils aren't as concentrated once they start to flower. But maybe if you've got multiple plants, let one of them flower and you can keep harvesting from the others. Mint, mints get giant. I don't know if you could ever possibly use all of the mint off one plant when they really get going, but a lot of these herbs are very attractive to bees and other pollinators as well. And then we have weeds. So weed is a plant whose virtue has yet to be found. So a lot of the plants that we consider weeds, or people consider weeds, can be attractive to pollinators as well. Things like dandelions, probably not the best nutritionally for pollinators, but it is a food source early in the year when nothing else is blooming in a lot of cases. Clover, again, same thing. Violet, or wild violet or state flower, a lot of people consider a weed. That is a native plant that can be attractive to pollinators as well. I pulled this slide from just a general pollinator presentation, but that purslane you get in your gardens, your driveways, if you got a gravel driveway, that is the food source for white-lined sphinx moths. Those caterpillars feed on that. So some of these weeds can also be larval food sources for butterflies and moths, like violets. Again, great spangled fritillary caterpillars will feed on violets. So another one of those weeds that we're trying to get rid of can be a food source for pollinators. When it comes to selecting plants, there's a lot of different information out there. Pollinator Partnership has some good resources. Their planting guides are broken up kind of by provinces, by plant provinces. So down here in Jacksonville, we're the Prairie Parkland province. I'm not sure if Chicagoland, if you're in the same or if you're in a different one, but you can go to their website and put in your zip code and it'll pop up what province you're in. And they have lists of plants that do well in there. Xerxes Society has another list for the Midwest region. Good plants to use. With the University of Illinois Extension, we just came out with our pollinator website earlier this year. On there, we have a plant selector tool, so you can look at different characteristics, the sun exposure, soil moisture, when it blooms, flower color, flower height. Click those different things and it'll spit out what flowers meet that criteria. I was poking around on the Sag Moraine website before this afternoon. I noticed they have plant selector on there too as well. So there's a lot of different plant selectors out there when it comes to native plants. All right, some of the things we can do in our landscapes for pollinators here. So you mentioned earlier that habitat fragmentation, habitat loss is a big problem. So trying to provide some of that habitat for nesting and egg laying in our landscapes. So providing layers in the landscape, so shrubs, tall grasses, low-growing plants, trees, things like that. When we think of our typical urban suburban landscape, we've got turf grass, maybe a tree here and there, maybe a shrub. It's all kind of one level. Having those different layers makes that landscape more attractive. Again, having those small patches of bare ground. 70% of our native bee species are going to nest in the ground, so we need bare ground. In the horticultural world, and I'm as guilty as anybody, we preach mulch, put the mulch down, retain soil moisture, keep the weeds down. But we need to allow some bare patches in our landscapes to have these ground nesting bees. So that picture on the top, that is a bee in my strawberry patch that built its nest in the strawberry patch we have in our yard. Allowing that untidy garden, leafcutter bees are going to feed on stuff, caterpillars are going to feed on stuff. Let your pollinator garden look a little ragged. If stuff's eating it, it's healthy. Leaving dead tree trunks in your landscape, things like Carpenter bees can build their nests in there. Other beetles building their nests in there, so bees can come in and use it as well. We want to try to provide protection from wind and weather. Overwintering sites, brush piles are good. Leaving leaves in the fall, leaving plants stand in the landscape in the fall, and you can go clean them up in the spring. Leaving 12 to 18 inches of those flower stalks behind when we do cut back our wildflowers and things like that. So our tunnel nesting bees can build their nests in those pithy flower stalks. Again, 30% of native bees are nesting above the ground in cavities or flower stems. So leaving those in the landscape, again, providing those habitats for those bees to lay eggs and rear their young. Grasses, in my opinion, grasses get overlooked a lot in a lot of our native plantings. But again, they can provide habitat, they can enhance that design. So these are all our smaller bunch grasses that are native to Illinois. So the picture on the left there is prairie dropseed that can get 15, 18 inches tall and about as wide, and it kind of flops over. Side oats grama is the middle picture there, about 1.5 feet tall. And then on the far right, little blue stem, 2 to 4 feet tall. And with little blue stem, there are multiple different cultivars that are available. And it has pretty good fall color on it. So kind of a multi-season interest on those plants. And like I mentioned, I have heard of bumblebees building their nests near the bases of bunch grasses. So, and we've got butterflies and moths, some species, their caterpillars are going to feed on grasses. So again, it's providing habitat and food sources for other insects as well. Pollinator garden tip, some more. So our nesting boxes they're frequently talked about. You can see them and find them in garden centers and things like that. If you're going to be putting one of those out, I would lean towards the one on the right there. Depending on how good your screen is, you may or may not be able to see that that wooden block, those are all cut into trays. So you can take that apart and clean them out. One of the drawbacks of using a solid wood block is that over time, pathogens and parasites can build up. And I think it was in some research in Canada, I think it was either Toronto or Vancouver area. They looked at some of these nesting blocks and found over time these solid wood blocks, those pathogens and parasites can build up to a point where they actually start becoming detrimental. So you want to be able to open those up, clean them out, or if it's a solid wood block, you want to replace those every year, or not every year, every few years, so you don't have that buildup of stuff and start becoming a problem. Something on the left there, there's a lot of habitat, but I would be concerned about, are those pathogens, are those parasites and stuff going to build up over time if you're not going to clean that up? In the middle there, that's, again, we're talking about bees, but butterfly houses or hotels, whatever you want to call them, are sold a lot. Penn State did some research in this. They put out, I don't remember how many, 20, 30 plus butterfly habitats, went back throughout the year and looked at them. They did not find a single butterfly using those. They did find wasps and stuff and spiders and stuff using those as habitat, but butterflies do not use them. So you can put them out, probably not going to get butterflies, but you will get other things using them. So you are still providing habitat for other critters out there. Here's just an example of some of those nesting blocks. So this is at the Missouri Botanical Garden. Yeah, I think that's where I took these pictures. You can see here, so on the top picture there, those are sealed with mud, so that may be a mason bee or some type of wasp doing that. And on the picture on the right, these are kind of observation ones, so you can open up the side and you can see them building their nests. So hopefully they would clean these out or replace that wood every so often, again, just so you're not having a buildup of pathogens and parasites in those. Some other things we can do in our landscape, so we provide a source of water. In my landscape, I have a bird feeder or bird bath, and I just put a rock in there so that if bees or something come in there, they can climb on that rock, go down to get into the water and stuff. And I mentioned before, allow an untidy garden, be willing to accept some plant damage. So, if you've got a rose bush, you've got all kinds of circular holes cut in the margins, that may mean you have a pretty healthy leafcutter bee population. Plants produce more leaves than they need, so they can afford to lose several leaves. So if you see something like that, your rose plant's not going to die. It's not in danger, unless you have hundreds of leafcutter bees and a solitary rose plant that they're all cutting from. It's not going to have a detrimental effect on your rose plant. So just leave that and let them use those leaves to build their nests. Same thing with caterpillars. Caterpillars feeding on plants. If you want the butterflies, you got to have the caterpillars. So when it comes to pest management, we want to try to use IPM practices or integrated pest management. So with that, we're using a variety of different techniques to manage pests. And this is a whole presentation by itself. But we're not necessarily, there's multiple different techniques we can use to manage pests besides pesticides. In some cases, pesticides may be the best option. But I would argue in a pollinator planting, you really shouldn't be using pesticides because you're trying to attract insects to them. Vegetable garden, tree fruits, that's a different story. You're trying to harvest produce off of that. In some cases, you may need to use pesticides, and pesticides may be the best option to control some of our pests. If you are going to be using pesticides, don't apply to them when plants are in bloom, and more pesticide labels are indicating that you cannot use insecticides on plants when they are in bloom. If you are applying to plants that are in bloom, apply when pollinators are going to be less active from dawn to dusk. Typically, most of our pollinators are out during the day. You spray in the evening, you may get some moths, but there is no perfect time where nothing's going to be out. Then we can try looking at pesticides that are known to be less harmful to pollinators. So Purdue University Extension has an information on protecting honeybees from pesticides. That gets into the toxicity of different pesticides to honeybees. All the research is done on honeybees. There's not really any information on our native bee species on how toxic pesticides are to them. Best we can do is on honeybees. And it's a good idea to watch your garden, keep a journal. What kind of insects, what kind of bees are you seeing in your landscape? What plants are they visiting? When are they visiting them? If you've got plants that nothing is visiting, maybe you're looking at the wrong time of day, or maybe it's just not that attractive. That's maybe not something you want to plant more of. You want to plant something that's something different, or if you got plants that are constantly covered in pollinators, maybe you want to plant more of those. And I just threw a slide on wasps in here. Because if you're providing this habitat, you're going to have bees, you're going to have other things, and for whatever reason, people get really worked up about wasps. Like a lot of things, it's a few individuals that ruin it for everybody. So if you got things like yellow jackets, bald-faced hornets, European hornets to an extent, and paper wasp, these are our social wasps. They build nests. They can get very aggressive defending their nests, just like honeybees and bumblebees will if you mess with them. But they can be, a little more aggressive on the aggressive side, particularly this time of year when food supplies are running out, and things like that. So again, most of our wasp species are actually going to be solitary species. So unless you pick them up and grab them, they're going to leave you alone. But nectar is actually the primary source for the adults. Bees are just vegetarian wasps. The larvae will feed on other insects, but the adults are feeding on nectar primarily. A lot of the plants that we are planting for bees and other pollinators, wasps are also going to find attractive. So plants in the carrot family, like that Rattlesnake Master, asters, mints, and milkweeds and things like that are going to be attractive to wasps as well. And they can be very effective pollinators in some cases, sometimes maybe not so much. Depends on how well they're able to carry pollen, how much they groom themselves, so on and so forth. But wasps will also act as pollinators in our landscapes as well, and they can provide some insect control for you. They are capturing insects to feed to their offspring. Some of them, the solitary wasps, can be rather specific. Some of them only feed on katydids. Some of them only feed on spiders. Others are more generalists, particularly our social types, our yellow jackets and stuff. They'll feed on anything they can catch, and take it back to their nest to feed their young. All right, so when it comes to creating habitat, several different ways we can do that. So we can create or enhance habitat in peripheral areas. This may be a little more applicable to kind of commercial settings or farmers, things like that, but field edges, fence rows, road edges, unused land, parking lots, things like that. You can convert an existing garden bed or create a new one. I'll say the top picture, that is my house. So what we did, that area in between the road and the sidewalk, the boulevard, the house strip, whatever you want to call it, we took all the grass out of there and put that into native plants there, because it was kind of a pain to mow because we have power line and other street signs in there. So we just went with native plants so we don't have to mow it anymore. One common complaint people have about some of our more natural looking landscapes or plantings is it looks like a big weed patch. And there's actually been research done on this, that if you mow a strip around that planting, it makes it look intentional and people are much more willing to accept it. So that picture on the bottom there, you can see they mowed a strip all the way around that, or next to that road there, so it makes it look intentional. And this is in Prairie Crossing in Grays Lake, Illinois. So this is a subdivision, and I think all of the houses there are required to have a certain amount of native planting in their landscape. So if you drive through there, every house has big wildflower beds in their landscape. And again, it's just a bunch of weeds. Add a sign. There's all kinds of different organizations, including Illinois Extension, that will be more than happy to sell you a sign saying pollinator habitats, monarch habitat, you name it. Establishing new sites. This is from seed. I will say if you're doing this in a home garden, plugs or pots are probably going to be your best bet. It's going to be a little more expensive, but it's going to be a little bit quicker. You don't have to worry about identifying seedlings as to whether or not this is a desirable species or if it's a weed. But larger areas, if you do it in seeds, that's going to take 1 to 3 years to kill off the seeds. Most people usually do one, but if you do it for multiple years, you draw down that weed seed bank in the soil a little bit better. You want to choose that proper seed mix. So take into consideration your site conditions, what are the moisture levels like, where the soil like, is it sandy soil, is it a clay soil, is it a loamy soil? What's the sun exposure? Full sun, part shade, what have you. NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, has seed mixes. A lot of different native plant nurseries have pre-made seed mixes. You can custom make them as well. You want to put the seeds in the ground, whether that's broadcasting them, drilling them, what have you. and then keep killing the weeds. So it's going to be a couple of years of mowing and stuff, keeping those weeds down before your native plants take over. So it's usually sleep, creep, and leap. So it can take 2 or 3 years before that planting really takes off if you're going to be doing it from seeds. These are a couple resources if you want to do it from seed. Pollinator Meadow, Upper Midwest Installation Guide and Checklist from the Xerxes Society, and then USDA NRCS Pollinator Biology and Habitat gets into establishing pollinator habitat. And like I mentioned earlier, we do have Illinois Pollinators is a good friend website. University of Illinois Extension released earlier this year, so all about pollinators, different types of pollinators, why they're important. The plants pollinators use the plant selector tool. We have designs, pre-made designs. You go out, pick those plants out with alternative plants if you can't find some of those plants in that design in there. Information on community science, citizen science that you can take part in, educational resources for teachers, for kids and stuff like that, as well as a section for research being done at the University of Illinois on pollinators. So that's illinoispollinators.org. If you were interested in that stuff, and we're going to be updating it for the next couple of years. So it's by no means is it a complete website right now. We'll continue to update that for the next few years. And then with that, that's what I've got for you tonight. So here, like I mentioned earlier, do the Good Growing blog, Good Growing podcast if you want to check those out, since I have a captive audience. There you go. You can subscribe, and we'll send you an email every Friday with a link to the blog and the podcast as well, if you don't want to have to find that every week. So that we can.
Thank you very much, Ken. And did you say that if anybody has any questions, they can email you?
Yep, you can email me. My email is on the slide there. It's K Johnson. There is no N at the end. Whoever K Johnson is gets lots of emails for me, I think, but it's kjohnson@illinois.edu.
Okay, and I just want to mention to everybody, you mentioned our native plant selector on the website, the Sag Moraine website. What we tried to do is put together a native plant selector that is specifically geared for smaller urban and suburban landscapes. Tried to vet some of the plants and not put in varieties that are going to get too tall or be too aggressive for smaller landscapes. So anybody that is interested in planting your garden, take a look at that. Does anybody in the room here have any questions? Go ahead.
We're looking at going along the side private road with bushes. And I wanted to ask if there are any particular bushes that would be higher and for better for pollinators.
Sure. So we had a question, Ken. What are some bushes, shrubs that you recommend to have high pollinator value?
So I like lead plant. It's not particularly big. It kind of dies back a little bit. Button bush is good. Let me get back to that shrub. Button bush, 9-bark is a good one as well. Those are kind of the three that come to mind off the top of my head.
Did you say you're doing this all along a road?
Yeah.
Because my experience with people with 9-bark is that it's really easy to grow. So she's looking at putting this all along a road. So kind of having a lot of it. So do you think 9-bark would be a good choice?
Yeah, my experience has been pretty easy to grow. I've only been growing it for a few years, but it's and there's getting into small trees with some of the service berries and things like that.
Perfect. Did you say that you do a whole presentation on pesticide use? And because we always say, try to limit your use of pesticides, but really that's sometimes we have to acknowledge that pesticides are necessary. Like if you have three small kids and you have a hornet's nest in your backyard. I mean, there's times when, and to know like proper use, the best use, do you give a presentation on that as well?
I've got presentations on just kind of pest management in general that I do and stuff.
Okay. Wonderful. I'm probably going to be reaching out to you about that. A lot of times we get people that ask, when we're trying to promote, planting for pollinators, people who are fearful of drawing bees, the fear of bees. What would you say to that?
Well, if you're planting flowers, you're going to get bees. Bees are only, so our solitary bee species are not going to be aggressive at all. You can, unless you grab them or step on them, they're not going to sting you. They don't defend their nests because you've got one female doing it, and if she dies, game over. So they don't defend their nests. The social bees and wasps will defend their nests. But if you leave those nests alone, they're not going to come after you. They're not, for the bees, they're not aggressive. I probably shouldn't tell people this, but go out and you can pet bumblebees while they're feeding on plants. Again, as long as you're not grabbing them and stepping on them, they're going to leave you alone. Wasps this time of year, a little bit different story. Yellow jackets stuff. As their food sources start declining, they get a little more aggressive. They start visiting picnics, sugary drinks, things like that. They get a little more aggressive and can become a little more problematic. But I guess on the positive side, those yellow jackets and all those colonies are annual. So we get a hard frost or two, everything dies off, and they don't reuse those nests. So if you had a yellow jacket nest in the ground 1 year in a spot, I'm not going to say never because I'll get myself in trouble doing that, but they don't reuse those nests year to year. Yeah, if you're planting flowers and trying to attract pollinators, there's nothing you can do to keep the bees and stuff out. Just if you respect them, they'll leave you alone. You leave them alone, they'll leave you alone, type thing.
So we have a question: is pokeweed a good addition to the garden for bees?
It can be a pollinator source, but the birds will feed on the berries, but you're going to be picking those plants out of everywhere. It
spreads.
It is a native plant, but it is an aggressive spreader, and it's got a very big taproot, and it can be difficult. It's a pretty plant. I would say if you had a bigger landscape and you don't mind the kind of weediness of it, you could work. Your neighbors may not appreciate it, especially if the birds are sitting over their car and depositing those seeds, because they'll stain and stuff. But they will use it. But I would say 99% of people do not want that in their landscape because it can become weedy.
So Ken, you mentioned the bees building in in a compost pile, and that actually happened to me. And I am wondering, when is the best time to eventually? I have a brush pile, and I like to chip it down every once in a while and use the branches for my paths. But if I have an established nest in my brush pile, when would be a good time to get rid of it?
So ideally you'd wait till after you have a hard frost or two and that nest has died off, because they don't reuse them.
Oh, they do not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, honeybees are really the only thing that are going to use the same nest year after year. So let's say they don't. Watch me, they'll reuse it next year. But yeah, typically they're not going to reuse those nests. They'll start a new one every year because all the individuals from that colony die off. The females are overwintering, they're going off, they're dispersing in the landscape and overwintering, and then they will start a new nest the following year. So get a hard frost or two. When you stop seeing activity, things coming in and out, and that nest is dead, then you can take that apart. Now you may have things that are trying to overwinter in it, but if you do it early enough, they can find somewhere else to go.
Okay.
What are your thoughts about glyphosate use for invasives like honeysuckle and buckthorn? We have been told various things about their persistence in the environment and the effects on insects and animals, including humans. Is horticulture vinegar a viable option?
Probably not for that stuff. Horticultural vinegar, you're going to be repeatedly applying that. Glyphosate is going to be systemic. Typically, when you're doing invasive species control, glyphosate or triclopyr are going to be the two that are recommended. A lot of times you're going to cut stumps, you're going to cut that woody plant material and then paint the stump that's left on the ground with those herbicides, and that'll get down into the root system and kill it. So glyphosate is one of the recommended ways of managing a lot of our invasive species, because it is pretty effective at managing most of those.
So if you're doing that in large areas, but what about somebody's like, smaller backyard? If they have like a couple, a few honeysuckle plants coming up, should they bring out the glyphosate? But if you have a small problem, is there a better way to handle it?
Herbicide is probably gonna be the most efficient doing that cut stump. You can repeatedly cut and eventually kind of wear the plant out, draw down its reserves, but you're gonna be doing that for several years. And you have to keep on top of it, make sure you keep cutting it back and stuff. So, herbicides are gonna be the quickest way to do it if you've got an established weed plant. But you can repeatedly cut and just, deplete the reserves of the plant, but you got to keep on top of it.
Do you have a good source for the wooden insect tubes that you showed?
Like the nesting blocks.
Yes.
Not a specific company. I would just look for ones that are, again, those trays that you can open up and clean, ideally. And some people with
Elisa,
those.
I was just gonna say the one that I like, Elisa, are from Crown Bee or Osmia Bee.
And some people will.
Removable tubes.
The tubes, yeah. And some people with those, they will, particularly if they're doing the mason bees, leaf cutter bees, they will open those up in the winter and store those inside so critters can't get to them and they can clean them out. And then when things start warm up, they start emerging, they'll let them outside.
Yeah, I'm a nerd that has bee cocoons in my refrigerator all winter.
I've heard people doing it, leaving in their garage. If they have like a detached garage, they'll put them in there and stuff, so they're kind of exposed to the same conditions they would be outside too. So a couple different ways you can do it.
So what are your thoughts on whether joey bees are becoming a threat to native pollinators?
What kind of bees?
It says joey bees, Joey.
I am not familiar.
I'm not either. Maybe that's a misspelled. Anthony, do you want to ask your question again? Am I misreading it?
Yeah, Anthony, let us know what, yeah, we're not familiar with that name.
We'll move on to the next question. I know that the castor bean plant is poisonous to humans, but is it beneficial to pollinators?
Yeah, I don't know how widely visited it is with pollinators, how frequently they visit that. Yeah, I mean, if things are visiting those flowers, feeding on the pollen and nectar, it's benefiting them at least in some way. Is it the best plant? I don't know for sure how attractive it is.
But. So Anthony did come back and say that he meant honeybees, not joey bees. So I think you did talk about
autocorrect.
Yeah. Yeah. Blame the spelling algorithms.
So for honeybees, there has been some research I've seen and in kind of natural areas where they have where they bring in honeybee colonies to overwinter, or there is some concern with that, where you have, or not overwinter, but spend the summer, like in the Dakotas, and then they've been talk of opening up some of the natural areas for overwintering honeybees or oversummering honeybees in that area. And when you have these colonies that can have 50,000 individuals, and you have multiple of them out there, they can go out and strip an area of the resources and outcompete native species in an urban setting, where you've got a lot of people planting flowers and stuff. I don't think it's as big of a concern. In urban settings, we tend not to have as many of those specialist bees just because, the habitat's been destroyed. Those plants haven't been there for a long time. So those specialist bees aren't necessarily present. A lot of the bees we see in our landscapes are, urban suburban landscapes are more generalist bees. Because the specialist plants aren't there, so the specialist bees aren't going to be there.
Would you say that the unnecessary raising of honey, I think a lot of people started raising honeybees because they thought that they were helping the environment over the years, because most of the PR, the talk was about honeybees. Would you, in your opinion, do you think it's better to not raise those honeybees and put our focus more on, just, planting to help our native bees?
Yeah, so I think
obviously in farm areas and so on, we need, the honeybees and but if you're talking about in a, more of a suburban environment and so on, is it best to put your focus on the native bees?
Yeah, so I think a little bit depends on why you're raising the honeybees. Like you mentioned, and I don't know who said this, but the quote of, if trying to raising honeybees to save bees is like raising chickens to save birds. Honeybees are basically livestock. We treat them as livestock. We can, we care for them. People treat them for pests and things like that. They feed them, things like that. So if you want to raise bees for the nectar, or not the honey, and the wax, things like that, by all means go for it. But if you're trying to kind of save the bee population by honeybees, that's not the best way to do it. It's providing that habitat. Because again, honeybees are an introduced species. They're not native to North America. So I would focus more on the providing habitat for the native bee species and stuff like that, as opposed to raising bees or honeybees if you're concerned about conserving bee populations. Again, by all means, if you want that pollen, if you want that nectar, if you want the honey, you want the wax, things like that, those products those bees are producing, then by all means go do it. But yeah.
The bee vomit.
Yes, the bee vomit. Yeah, I don't really like honey, so describing it as bee vomit doesn't bother me.
I'll never eat my peanut butter and honey sandwiches again without thinking of that. Oh dear.
And Jill asks, we have one more question on here. Jill asks, can all of these bees you talk about sting you, or only if they're agitated?
Yeah, all bees. Well, yeah, these bees are all capable of stinging. Again, usually, unless you are bothering them or threatening them in some way, they're probably not going to sting you. Most people get stung by bees if you step on them. Somehow they get caught in your clothing and they can't get out. You may get stung. You get too close to in the case of social bees, honeybees, bumblebees, you get too close to their colony, you disturb it. They will defend it. The social bees will. Unless you are harassing them, grabbing them, stepping on them, they're not going to sting you.
Any more questions from the peanut gallery over here? No. Well, we're good. This was fantastic, Ken. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for this. This was a wonderful talk. Let's give Ken a hand.
Thank you.
And thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Yes.
Thank you. Happy to do this.
And thank you, Mary Gelder, and thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll see you in the next one. Good night, everyone.